Some cases follow you home, but this one followed me into my bloodline. I'm Detective Lydia Cross, Hartford PD Homicide Division, and I've been working murder cases for 16 years. You develop a certain detachment after seeing enough bodies, a professional distance that keeps you functional when families are screaming and crime scenes are telling stories you wish you'd never learned to read. But the Thornwick Archive murders stripped that away from me, layer by layer, until I was left staring at evidence that pointed back through generations of my own family. Hartford's not a small town, but our homicide division runs lean. Most nights, I'm catching cases solo, or with whatever backup the department can spare. The Thornwick Public Library sits in the old downtown district, a massive brick building from 1897 that the city's been threatening to renovate for decades. The basement archives stretch deeper than most people know, housing everything from old newspapers to police records that predate digital filing. On paper, it's just storage. In practice, it's where information goes to be forgotten. The first call came in on a Tuesday morning in March. Library employee found a body in the basement archives, posed with what looked like vintage police files. Patrol officers secured the scene, but they'd already flagged it as unusual enough for homicide. When I arrived, the building felt different than I remembered from childhood, visits heavier somehow, like the air itself was holding its breath. The victim was Margaret Holloway, 63, a retired librarian who'd been volunteering to help digitize old records. She was positioned sitting upright at one of the archive tables, hands folded over a stack of manila folders. Her eyes were closed, face peaceful, but the medical examiner would later find ligature marks, suggesting she'd been strangled elsewhere and moved. What made my skin crawl wasn't the staging I'd seen theatrical killers before. It was the files she'd been posed with. The folders were labeled with case numbers from 1954 through 1957, all bearing the signature of Detective Frank Cross, my Uncle Frank, the one who died when I was 12, the one who'd inspired me to join the force. According to library records, those specific files had been destroyed in a basement flood back in 1978, along with most police records from that era. Yet here they were, dry and intact, containing crime scene photos and witness statements in handwriting I recognized from family letters. I photographed everything before bagging the evidence, but when I developed the images that night, something was wrong. The case files in the photos showed different dates: 1989, 1992, 2001, years when Frank had been dead for decades. I checked my digital camera's timestamp. It matched my notes exactly, but the evidence told a different story. The second murder happened 4 days later. Thomas Brennan, a local historian researching the library's collection for a book about Hartford's development. Same staging, same peaceful expression, same impossible files. This time, the folders contained witness statements from missing persons cases that Frank had worked, complete with interview notes in his distinctive handwriting. But the dates were from after his death, and some referenced crimes that hadn't been reported until years later. I started pulling Frank's original case files from the department's storage facility, comparing the handwriting with what we'd found at the crime scenes. They matched perfectly, down to the way he dotted his I's and crossed his T's. But the cases described in the archive files diverged from the official records in subtle ways: different suspect descriptions, alternative witness accounts, evidence that had never been processed. It was as if someone had been maintaining parallel investigations for decades. The third victim was found on a Sunday. Sarah McKnight, a genealogy researcher who'd been tracing families with connections to old Hartford police cases. She was posed with files that made my blood turn to ice water. They contained Frank's notes about cases involving the Cross family, my family. My grandfather's suspicious death in 1956, officially ruled an accident. My great-aunt's disappearance in 1958, never solved. And at the bottom of the stack, a file with yesterday's date and my own name typed on the tab. Inside was a crime scene report describing Sarah McKnight's murder, written in Frank's handwriting, dated 3 days before her body was discovered. Every detail matched what I'd observed at the scene, down to the arrangement of her clothing and the specific manila folders she'd been posed with. But the most disturbing element was a note paperclipped to the front. "Lydia will understand when she sees the pattern. The archive remembers what we choose to forget." I started interviewing witnesses again, people who'd spoken to the victims in the days before their deaths. But when I showed them my notes from our previous conversations, they looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Mrs. Patterson, who'd seen Margaret Holloway arguing with someone in the library parking lot, claimed we'd never spoken. The security guard who'd reported seeing Thomas Brennan after hours insisted he'd never filed such a report. Each person I'd interviewed was adamant that our conversations had never happened, despite my detailed notes and recorded phone calls. The department's digital systems showed the same disturbing inconsistencies. My case reports existed in the files, but the witness statements I'd attached were blank documents. Phone records showed calls to numbers that had been disconnected for years. Crime scene photos displayed evidence that didn't match my physical samples. It was as if the investigation was being rewritten around me, editing me out of my own work. I decided to visit the library archives alone, after hours, using my uncle's old case files as a guide. The basement felt different in the darkness, colder, more oppressive, like walking into a mouth that was slowly closing. I found the section where each victim had been discovered, but the tables were arranged differently than I remembered from the crime scenes. In the center of the room was a filing cabinet that hadn't been there before, labeled Cross-Family Cases, Ongoing. Inside were dozens of folders, all in Frank's handwriting, documenting investigations that had supposedly ended with his death. Cases about missing persons who'd been connected to the library, about strange deaths in families who'd donated historical documents, about a pattern of disappearances that stretched back to the building's construction, and at the very back, a thick folder with my name on it. The file contained crime scene photos of Margaret Holloway, Thomas Brennan, and Sarah McKnight, but they showed me at each scene, not as an investigator, but as the killer. My face was clear in every image, my hands positioning the bodies, my signature on evidence bags I'd never touched. The final page was a warrant for my arrest, signed by a judge who died in 1994, dated for today. I heard footsteps in the hallway above, heavy, deliberate, wearing boots I recognized from old family photos, Frank's boots. I grabbed the files and ran for the exit, but the basement stairs seemed to stretch longer than they should have, and each step echoed with the sound of typewriter keys clacking in the darkness behind me. When I finally reached street level, my car was gone, replaced by Frank's old patrol vehicle from the 1950s, engine running, driver's door open and waiting. The next morning, I woke up in my apartment with no memory of how I'd gotten home. The files I'd taken were gone, replaced by official department paperwork assigning the Thornwick murders to a different detective. According to the records, I'd never been involved in the case. My reports had vanished. My crime scene photos were credited to other officers, and when I tried to access the case files, the system showed no record of Detective Lydia Cross in the Hartford PD database. I still drive past the library sometimes, but I never stop. Through the windows, I can see lights in the basement archives, and occasionally, I spot a figure in an old-style police uniform filing reports at one of the tables. The building is scheduled for renovation next year, but somehow, I doubt they'll ever get to the basement. Some archives are meant to stay buried, and some investigations are designed to continue long after the investigators are gone. The Thornwick murders were officially closed when they found enough evidence to blame a transient who died in the state hospital 3 months before the first killing. It was a neat solution that satisfied everyone except the families. But police work is sometimes about accepting the answers that let people sleep at night, even when you know they're not the whole truth. I've been thinking about taking early retirement, maybe moving somewhere that doesn't have libraries with basement archives. But every time I open a case file, I see my handwriting shifting slightly, becoming more like Frank's, and I wonder if leaving would even matter. Some family businesses follow you wherever you go, and some cases never really end. They just pass from one generation to the next, waiting in filing cabinets that remember everything we're supposed to forget. Time stops differently in places where people disappear all at once. I'm Vincent Harper, Massachusetts State Police Cold Case Unit, and I've been working unsolved disappearances for 11 years. Most cold cases are about patience, waiting for new technology, fresh witnesses, or that one piece of evidence that got overlooked the first time around. You learn to accept that some people vanish without explanation, that families deserve closure even when the truth refuses to cooperate. But the Brookhaven Mill case taught me that sometimes the disappeared aren't really gone. They're just stuck in a moment that never learned how to end. The mill sits on the outskirts of Lowell, a massive brick structure from the industrial boom that the city's been trying to demolish for decades. Environmental concerns, historic preservation appeals, and a maze of property disputes have kept it standing like a monument to economic collapse. The building's been empty since the textile company went bankrupt in 1991, but the neighbors still complain about noise from inside machinery, sounds, voices, the distant echo of work that officially stopped 33 years ago. Cold case files pile up differently than active investigations. They're organized by probability of resolution, with the most hopeless cases buried deepest in the filing system. The Brookhaven disappearances had been sitting in that bottom drawer since I joined the unit. 19 people who'd simply failed to clock out on March 15, 1991. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just empty workstations and time cards that showed them arriving for their shift but never leaving. I pulled the file on a Wednesday morning in October, mainly because I needed something to occupy my mind while waiting for DNA results on a more promising case. The original investigating officers had done thorough work, interviewed every employee who'd called in sick that day, checked financial records for signs of planned disappearance, even brought in cadaver dogs to search the building. Nothing. 19 people had simply stepped out of existence during an 8-hour shift, leaving behind only their personal belongings and a factory floor that looked like everyone had stepped away for a lunch break that never ended. The witness statements were frustratingly consistent. Employees who'd left at the end of the previous shift reported normal operations. The night security guard had made his rounds without incident. The morning shift supervisor had found the building empty, except for machines still running and work half finished on the production line. It was as if 19 people had simultaneously decided to abandon their posts and disappear into the Massachusetts countryside. What caught my attention were the architectural inconsistencies in the case file. The building blueprints attached to the original investigation showed a standard textile mill layout, main production floor, administrative offices, storage areas, and employee facilities. But when I compared them to the city planning department's records, the layouts didn't match. Different room configurations, additional stairwells, whole sections that appeared in one set of plans but not the other. I assumed it was bureaucratic confusion until I requested the most recent architectural survey. The current blueprints showed yet another layout, with corridors that curved in impossible directions and production floors that overlapped with administrative spaces. When I called the surveying company, they insisted their measurements were accurate, but admitted the building had been difficult to map because of structural inconsistencies that seemed to change between visits. The lead surveyor mentioned that his equipment had malfunctioned repeatedly, showing rooms that his eyes couldn't confirm and hallways that appeared on his instruments but not in his photographs. I decided to visit the mill myself, bringing along Detective Patricia Kowalski from the Lowell PD, who'd worked security details at the building during the original investigation. She'd been a rookie then, but she remembered the case clearly, how the other officers had joked about the Marie Celeste of textile mills, until the family started demanding answers that nobody could provide. Patricia had volunteered to accompany me, partly out of professional curiosity, and partly because she'd never stopped wondering what had happened to those 19 people. The building's exterior looked exactly as described in the case files, but when we gained access through the security company, the interior felt wrong in ways that were hard to articulate. The main production floor stretched longer than the blueprints suggested, filled with textile machinery that looked like it had been abandoned mid-operation. Bobbins of thread sat half-wound. Cutting tables held partially completed patterns, and quality control stations displayed fabric samples that seemed to shimmer with colors that hadn't existed in 1991. Patricia noticed it first, the sound of machinery running somewhere deeper in the building, a rhythmic, mechanical humming that seemed to emanate from walls that should have been solid. We followed the sound through corridors that curved in directions that didn't match our mental map of the building's exterior, past doors marked with department names that weren't listed in any of the company records. The deeper we went, the more the building felt like it was actively expanding around us, creating new spaces to accommodate our investigation. We found the security office on what should have been the third floor, though we'd only climbed 2 flights of stairs. The room contained monitoring equipment that was far more sophisticated than anything mentioned in the original case files: digital cameras, motion sensors, and recording devices that looked decades newer than the rest of the building's fixtures. When Patricia activated the monitors, they showed feeds from dozens of locations throughout the mill, including areas we hadn't seen, and some that appeared to be underground levels that didn't exist on any building plans. The most disturbing feed showed the main production floor, but not as we'd seen it minutes earlier. This version was fully operational, with workers moving between machinery, supervisors checking quality control stations, and all the normal activity of a functioning textile mill. The timestamp showed today's date, but the workers were wearing clothes from the early 1990s, and their movements had a strange repetitive quality, like actors following a script they'd memorized too well. Patricia rewound the footage, and we watched the same 8-hour shift play out in reverse: workers backing away from their stations, walking backward through doorways, clocking out in reverse chronological order. When she advanced the playback to normal speed, the entire sequence repeated exactly, down to individual gestures and facial expressions. The timestamp kept updating to show current date and time, but the content never varied. We compared the workers' faces to the missing person photos from the original case file. Every single person matched: Margaret Sullivan at the cutting station, Robert Tavares operating the loom, Catherine McMahon inspecting finished products. 19 people who'd been missing for 33 years, still reporting for their shift every day, still performing the same tasks in the same sequence, trapped in a workday that had never been allowed to end. I tried to access other camera feeds, but the system seemed to anticipate my selections. Every monitor I activated showed the same production floor from different angles, all displaying the identical shift, all time-stamped with the current date. Patricia attempted to copy the footage to her portable drive, but the files corrupted during transfer, leaving only static images that hurt to look at directly. We returned to the actual production floor, but it had changed during our absence. The machinery was now running, filling the space with the mechanical symphony we'd been hearing throughout the building. Workers moved between the stations with practiced efficiency, but they cast no shadows and made no sound beyond the noise of their equipment. When I called out to them, none looked up from their tasks. When Patricia walked directly through their work area, they continued their activities as if she weren't there. I approached Margaret Sullivan, the missing person whose photograph I'd studied most carefully. She was exactly as described in the case file: mid-30s, brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing a blue work shirt with her name embroidered on the pocket. But when I spoke to her, she didn't respond. When I touched her shoulder, my hand passed through fabric that felt like memory rather than cloth. She continued cutting patterns from fabric that shimmered with impossible colors, her movements precise and repetitive and utterly empty of consciousness. The shift change happened at exactly 6 o'clock, just as the time clocks showed in the security footage. One by one, the workers stopped their tasks, cleaned their stations, and walked toward the exit in perfect synchronization. But instead of leaving the building, they simply faded away, becoming translucent and then invisible as they approached the doors. Within minutes, the production floor was empty again, machines silent, ready for the next shift that would begin at exactly 6 in the morning. Patricia and I left the building as the sun was setting, but when we reached our cars, we realized we'd been inside for nearly 12 hours, despite feeling like we'd only spent a few minutes investigating. My watch showed the correct time, but my phone displayed messages from my supervisor asking why I hadn't reported in for my shift that had ended hours ago. Patricia had similar discrepancies, voicemails from her family, wondering why she'd missed dinner plans she didn't remember making. We filed our report as a routine follow-up investigation, noting structural concerns that might explain the acoustic anomalies neighbors had reported. The security footage somehow corrupted itself before we could submit it as evidence, leaving only audio files that contained nothing but static. The case remains officially unsolved, though we recommended against further investigation due to building safety concerns. The mill was finally demolished last month, but the workers still clock in every morning. I know because I drive past the empty lot on my way to work, and sometimes I see them translucent figures moving through the space where the building used to stand, still performing their tasks, still trapped in a shift that began 33 years ago and has never been allowed to end. Some schedules are stronger than death, and some jobs continue long after the workplace has been reduced to memories and empty foundations. I've stopped taking cold cases involving missing groups of people. Individual disappearances are hard enough to solve, but when multiple people vanish simultaneously, you're usually dealing with something that transcends normal investigation. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, they're meant to be contained, forgotten, and left to repeat themselves in places where time has learned to loop instead of flow. The Brookhaven Mill case taught me that work can become a form of haunting, that routine can trap souls as effectively as any supernatural force. Sometimes, the disappeared aren't really gone, they're just stuck clocking in and out of a reality that forgot how to let them leave. Some frequencies carry more than just voices, they carry the weight of unfinished business. I'm Detective Natasha Bloom, Montana State Police Major Crimes Unit, and I've been working homicide cases across rural counties for 14 years. Out here, murders are usually straightforward domestic disputes, bar fights, hunting accidents that weren't accidents. The isolation breeds simple violence, the kind that leaves clear motives and obvious suspects. But the Stonewood radio tower case introduced me to something far more disturbing: the possibility that death doesn't always silence the voices that need to be heard. The call came in on a Thursday morning in November, routing through 3 different dispatcher centers before reaching my desk. A maintenance worker had found a body at the Stonewood radio station, an automated facility that sat alone on a ridge 40 miles southeast of Billings. The station had been operating unmanned for over a decade, broadcasting automated programming and emergency alerts to a coverage area that included some of the most isolated ranches in the state. According to the initial report, someone had broken into the transmitter building and died under suspicious circumstances. I made the drive in my unmarked cruiser, following state routes that grew progressively more desolate as they climbed into the high plains. The radio tower itself was visible from miles away, a steel lattice structure rising 300 feet above the surrounding grassland, topped with red warning lights that blinked against the gray Montana sky. The transmitter building sat at its base like a concrete bunker, windowless except for a single steel door, and designed to operate without human presence for months at a time. The scene was secured by Deputy Miguel Ortega from the county sheriff's office, who looked relieved to see a state detective arrive. He'd been first responder and had already photographed the exterior, but he admitted the interior had made him uncomfortable enough to wait for backup before conducting a thorough search. When I asked what specifically had bothered him, he struggled to articulate it. Just a feeling that something was wrong beyond the obvious presence of a dead body. The victim was Gerald Bannister, 67, a former radio engineer who'd worked for the station before automation eliminated his position. According to the maintenance contractor who'd discovered the body, Bannister had no legitimate reason to be inside the facility. He'd been found seated at the broadcast console, slumped forward over a stack of transmission logs that shouldn't have existed. The station had been fully automated for over a decade, with no manual logging required or performed. What made my skin crawl wasn't the staging of the body, though that was disturbing enough. Someone had sewn Bannister's eyes shut with black thread, using precise stitches that suggested medical or tailoring experience. His hands were positioned over the transmission logs as if he'd been reading them at the time of death, and the expression on his face was one of concentration rather than pain or fear. The medical examiner would later determine he died of cardiac arrest, but the circumstances suggested he'd been restrained and mutilated before his heart gave out. The transmission logs themselves were impossible artifacts. They documented broadcasts that had supposedly occurred over the past 6 months, all manually logged in different handwriting styles, all signed by radio operators who'd been dead for years. I recognized some of the names from obituaries. I'd read local residents who'd passed away from natural causes, accidents, or in one case, a suicide I'd investigated personally 3 years earlier. Each log entry described detailed broadcasts, weather reports for dates that hadn't occurred yet, emergency bulletins about events that had never happened, and personal messages addressed to people who weren't listed in any local phone directories. The handwriting was distinctive for each supposed operator, and when I compared samples to personnel files from the station's active years, they matched perfectly. Dead people had apparently been broadcasting detailed weather forecasts and emergency information to an audience that didn't exist. Deputy Ortega helped me examine the broadcast equipment, though neither of us had technical expertise with radio transmission system. The console showed signs of recent manual operation settings had been adjusted, logbooks had been updated, and the main transmitter was running at power levels higher than its automated programming should have allowed. Most disturbing was a cassette tape labeled Emergency Override Protocols that was still loaded in the playback system, rewound to the beginning, as if someone had just finished listening to it. I played the tape on the console's audio system, expecting to hear standard emergency broadcast procedures. Instead, I heard voices I recognized, local residents describing disasters that had occurred years ago. Their accounts delivered in the calm, professional tones of trained radio announcers. The first voice belonged to Martha Henley, who died in a car accident 2 winters prior. But she was calmly describing the blizzard conditions that had killed her, as if she were reading a weather report to help other drivers avoid her fate. The second voice was even more disturbing. Roy Kimball, the suicide case I'd worked 3 years earlier, was broadcasting a detailed description of his mental state in the weeks leading up to his death. But instead of a confession or cry for help, he spoke like a public service announcer, warning other listeners about the signs of depression and providing resources for crisis intervention that might have saved his life if he'd known about them when he was alive. There were 17 different voices on the tape, all belonging to people who'd died in the coverage area over the past 5 years. Each was broadcasting information that could have prevented their death: weather warnings, safety advisories, mental health resources, medical emergency procedures. It was as if the dead were trying to use the radio station to save others from their fate, but their messages were being recorded rather than transmitted, trapped in a loop that served no audience except whoever had been listening in the transmitter building. I called the station's current management company to verify the technical specifications of the broadcast equipment. The engineer I spoke with insisted that manual operation wasn't possible. The system had been designed to prevent unauthorized access, and any attempt to override the automated programming would trigger alarms at their monitoring center. But according to their logs, no alarms had been received, and the station had been broadcasting normally for months. We found Gerald Bannister's vehicle parked behind the building, a pickup truck filled with radio equipment that looked decades old. His toolbox contained vacuum tubes, analog meters, and components that predated the station's current digital systems. In the glove compartment was a notebook filled with frequency notations and transmission schedules, all written in his handwriting, documenting broadcasts he'd supposedly been monitoring for over a year. The notebook entries described a pattern I was beginning to recognize. Every night, between 2 and 4 a.m., the station would temporarily switch from automated programming to manual operation. During those hours, the dead would broadcast their warnings, sharing information that could prevent others from suffering their fate. Bannister had been documenting these transmissions, trying to understand how the deceased were accessing the equipment and why their messages weren't reaching the intended audience. His final entry, dated the night of his death, was different from the others. Instead of describing received transmissions, he'd written about joining them, about taking his turn at the microphone to warn others about the dangers of investigating too deeply into frequencies that weren't meant for the living. He'd apparently realized that the radio station wasn't just receiving messages from the dead, it was recruiting operators from among those who discovered its secret. I spent the rest of the day interviewing the maintenance contractor and local residents who might have observed unusual activity at the radio station. But every person I spoke with reported the same thing. They'd never noticed anything unusual about the facility, never heard unauthorized broadcasts, never seen Bannister's truck on the access road. It was as if the nighttime operations existed in a reality that only affected those who were directly involved. As evening approached, I decided to remain at the station overnight to observe whether the phenomena described in Bannister's notebook would occur. Deputy Ortega volunteered to stay with me, though he admitted he hoped nothing would happen. We positioned ourselves in the transmitter building with monitoring equipment and recording devices, settling in to wait for the 2 a.m. shift change that Bannister had documented. The transformation began exactly at 2 o'clock. The automated programming cut to static, then to silence, then to the sound of someone adjusting microphone levels and shuffling papers. A voice I didn't recognize began reading weather conditions for the following day, but the forecasts described specific personal tragedies, car accidents, heart attacks, hunting mishaps, with the precise timing and location where they would occur. The announcer provided detailed instructions for avoiding each tragedy, speaking with the care of someone who understood the consequences of not being heard. More voices joined the broadcast, some I recognized from the cassette tape, others I didn't. They spoke in turns, sharing warnings about dangers they'd experienced, offering advice they'd learned too late to save themselves. But the most disturbing element wasn't their messages. It was the growing realization that I could hear Bannister's voice among them, reading from a script that described the investigation of his own death and warning future detectives about the risks of spending too much time listening to frequencies that carried more than just radio signals. The broadcast continued until exactly 4 a.m., then returned to static and resumed automated programming. But the console now showed manual adjustments that neither Deputy Ortega nor I had made, and the transmission logs contained new entries in handwriting I was beginning to recognize as my own. According to the logs, I'd been broadcasting warnings about my current investigation, advising other officers to close the case quickly and avoid prolonged exposure to the station's nighttime operations. We left the facility at dawn, but the drive back to civilization felt longer than it should have. My radio picked up fragments of the previous night's broadcasts on frequencies that shouldn't have been accessible, and Deputy Ortega reported similar reception problems. Both of our official radios began transmitting our own voices, playing back conversations we'd had at the station, but with subtle alterations, warnings about not investigating too deeply, advice about closing cases that couldn't be properly explained. The Stonewood radio tower case was officially closed, as death by natural causes during an unauthorized entry. Gerald Bannister's cardiac arrest was attributed to the stress of breaking into the facility, and the sewn-shut eyes were classified as post-mortem mutilation by an unknown perpetrator who was never identified. The transmission logs were filed as evidence, but somehow disappeared from the storage facility before the case review could be completed. I still monitor radio frequencies during my night shifts, but I'm careful to avoid the bands that the Stonewood station uses. Sometimes I hear familiar voices broadcasting from empty locations, sharing warnings about investigations that haven't been opened yet, and offering advice that could prevent tragedies if anyone were listening. The dead have things to say, and some radio towers are willing to give them airtime, but the living rarely tune in to frequencies that carry messages from beyond the grave. Montana has hundreds of automated radio stations operating in remote locations, and most of them probably broadcast exactly what they're supposed to. But some frequencies carry more than just emergency alerts and weather reports. They carry the voices of people who learned important lessons, too late to save themselves, and they're still trying to reach an audience that might benefit from their hard-won wisdom. The trick is knowing when to listen and when to turn off the radio before you become part of the broadcast yourself. Some bridges don't just span water, they span the space between life and whatever comes after. I'm Calvin Webb, Kansas City Police Department Missing Persons Division, and I've been tracking disappearances for 9 years. Most missing person cases resolve themselves within 72 hours. Runaways return home, adults turn up after extended drinking binges, and the few genuine mysteries usually involve foul play that leaves enough evidence to build a case. But the Liberty Memorial Bridge pattern challenged everything I thought I knew about how people vanish, because the witnesses kept reporting the same impossible thing. They were watching the same person die over and over again. The Liberty Memorial Bridge connects downtown Kansas City to the Museum District, spanning the Missouri River with a view that draws tourists and photographers year-round. It's also a magnet for people in crisis. The height and the symbolism make it a frequent location for suicide attempts. The bridge has safety barriers and emergency phones, but determined individuals still find ways to climb over the railings. What made this case different was the consistency of the witness reports and the complete absence of bodies. The pattern started becoming clear in late September when I began cross-referencing missing person reports with witness statements from the bridge area. Over the previous 6 months, 14 separate people had called police to report seeing someone jump from the Liberty Memorial Bridge. But when emergency responders arrived to search the water, they never found remains. River rescue teams, divers, and downstream patrols all came up empty, despite the Missouri River being shallow enough and slow enough that bodies typically surface within days. The first witness was Janet Morrison, a jogger who'd been crossing the bridge at dawn when she saw a man in a blue jacket climb over the safety barrier and jump. She'd called 911 immediately, provided a detailed description, and waited for police to arrive. But when I interviewed her 3 months later as part of my pattern analysis, she described seeing the exact same incident occur multiple times, always the same man, always the same blue jacket, always the same calm deliberation before he stepped into empty air. Similar reports came from different witnesses over the following months. A taxi driver named Eduardo Santos reported picking up fares who'd witnessed the same jumper, a woman in a red dress, who appeared every Tuesday morning around 10 a.m. A bridge maintenance worker, Dennis Park, claimed he'd seen a teenage boy in a school letterman jacket jump from the center span at least 6 times, always during his afternoon shift, always from the exact same section of railing. The descriptions were unnervingly consistent within each sighting category, but they described different people: the man in the blue jacket, the woman in the red dress, the teenager in the letterman jacket. What unified the reports was the repetitive nature of the sightings and the fact that nobody was ever recovered from the water. It was as if the bridge was displaying the same tragic events on a loop, but the people involved existed only during the moment of their death. I started spending time on the bridge myself, documenting traffic patterns and interviewing passers-by about unusual sightings. Most people reported normal bridge activity: commuters, tourists, the occasional emergency response to genuine incidents. But a significant minority described seeing repeated suicide attempts by individuals who matched the descriptions in my files. They were all adamant about what they'd witnessed, and many had called police multiple times about the same person jumping. The breakthrough came when I obtained security footage from the museum district's traffic cameras. The bridge itself wasn't directly monitored, but several cameras captured approaches to the pedestrian walkways. When I reviewed 6 months of footage, I found something that made my hands shake as I operated the playback controls. The cameras showed the witnesses arriving on the bridge, positioning themselves to observe the jumps, and then making frantic phone calls to emergency services. But the cameras never showed the jumpers themselves. Janet Morrison appeared in dozens of recordings, always jogging across the bridge at the same time, always stopping to stare at the same section of railing, always pulling out her phone to call police. But the footage showed her reacting to empty air. There was never anyone in a blue jacket, never anyone climbing over the barriers, never anyone jumping. She was calling police about events that existed only from her perspective. I confronted Janet with the security footage, expecting her to admit she'd been mistaken or seeking attention. Instead, she became agitated and insisted that the cameras must be malfunctioning. She described the jumper in even greater detail: his age, his facial expression, the exact way he'd gripped the railing before letting go. But when I asked her to point out where he'd jumped from, she led me to a section of the bridge where the barriers showed no signs of disturbance and the railing was pristine. Similar interviews with other witnesses produced the same results. They could describe their jumpers with photographic accuracy, could predict exactly when and where the incidents would occur, but security footage and physical evidence never corroborated their accounts. Yet their descriptions were so detailed and their emotional responses so genuine that I began to suspect they were witnessing something real that cameras simply couldn't capture. I decided to maintain surveillance on the bridge during the times when witnesses typically reported sightings. On a Tuesday morning in October, I positioned myself near the center span around 10 a.m., when Eduardo Santos had repeatedly seen the woman in the red dress jump. I brought binoculars, a camera with telephoto lens, and a digital audio recorder to document whatever occurred. At exactly 10:15 a.m., I felt a shift in the atmosphere around me, a sudden drop in temperature and a peculiar quality to the light that made the bridge feel isolated from the surrounding city. The normal sounds of traffic and wind seemed muffled, replaced by a silence that felt heavy with anticipation. I raised my binoculars and focused on the section of railing where Eduardo had reported seeing the woman. She was there, exactly as described: a woman in her 30s wearing a red dress, standing at the barrier with her hands gripping the top rail. But when I tried to photograph her, my camera's autofocus couldn't lock onto her figure. She appeared clearly to my naked eye, but the lens treated her like empty space. I could see her climbing over the railing, could observe the methodical way she positioned herself, could watch her step into empty air and fall toward the water below. The impact never came. As she fell, her figure became increasingly translucent until she simply faded from view. But within seconds, she was back at the railing, repeating the exact same sequence of movements. I watched her jump 7 times in the span of 15 minutes, each repetition identical to the last, each ending with her disappearance rather than impact. I tried to approach her during one of the loops, but as I moved closer, she became harder to see, like a television image losing signal. When I reached the spot where she'd been standing, there was nothing but empty railing and the normal sounds of the city returning. My audio recorder had captured only ambient noise, and my camera had photographed nothing but empty bridge infrastructure. The pattern continued with the other reported jumpers. During my evening surveillance, I witnessed the teenager in the Letterman jacket performing his endless leap from the center span. Late-night observations revealed the man in the blue jacket repeating his dawn suicide with mechanical precision. Each figure was visible only to direct observation, existed only during their moment of death, and repeated their final act with heartbreaking consistency. I began researching the bridge's history, looking for records of actual suicides that might correspond to the repeated sightings. What I found in the police archives was more disturbing than I'd expected. The man in the blue jacket matched the description of Thomas Kellerman, who jumped from the bridge in 1997. The woman in the red dress was consistent with Maria Santos, a suicide from 2003. The teenager resembled David Chen, who died on the bridge in 2009. All three cases had been closed as suicides, but the files contained disturbing anomalies. Thomas Kellerman's body had never been recovered despite extensive search efforts. Maria Santos had been witnessed jumping by multiple people, but no remains were found. David Chen's death had been reported by his school counselor, but the family insisted he'd been at home during the time of the alleged jump. In each case, the evidence for suicide was based entirely on witness accounts, with no physical confirmation of death. I began to suspect that the bridge was somehow trapping people at the moment of their suicide attempts, creating loops that replayed their final moments while their actual fate remained unclear. The witnesses weren't hallucinating, they were seeing genuine events that occurred outside normal time and space, captured and replayed by forces I couldn't understand or explain. My final night of surveillance nearly cost me my sanity. I'd positioned myself on the bridge during the early morning hours when all three jumpers typically appeared, hoping to observe them simultaneously and document the phenomenon more thoroughly. At around 3 a.m., the atmospheric shift occurred more dramatically than before. The bridge seemed to separate from the rest of the city, becoming an isolated stage where the same tragic performances played out endlessly. All three appeared at once: Thomas at the north end, Maria at the center, David near the south approach. They moved through their routines with choreographed precision, each jumping at intervals that created an overlapping cycle of death and renewal. But as I watched, I began to see other figures, dozens of them, positioned at various points along the bridge, all repeating their final moments in endless loops. The bridge was full of the dead, or the almost dead, or the never quite dead, people who'd chosen to end their lives at this location, but had somehow become trapped in the moment of decision, unable to complete their deaths or return to their lives. They existed in a liminal space where their suicides replayed forever, witnessed by the living who couldn't understand what they were seeing. I ran from the bridge that night, but the images followed me home. Every time I close my eyes, I see the endless repetition of final moments, the mechanical precision of despair playing out on a loop that never offers resolution or peace. I submitted a report recommending that the Missing Persons Division close the Liberty Memorial Bridge cases due to lack of evidence, but I've never returned to patrol that area. The bridge still draws witnesses who report seeing the same people jump repeatedly, and emergency responders still search for bodies that will never be found. Some places collect more than just memories. They collect the moments when people choose to leave, trapping those decisions in endless repetition. The Liberty Memorial Bridge has become a museum of final moments, displaying the last seconds of lives that ended without ever quite finishing, witnessed by the living who mistake eternal loops for isolated tragedies. I've learned to avoid bridges during my investigations, especially ones with histories of suicide. Some crossings don't just span rivers, they span the space between decision and consequence. And once you've seen what gets trapped in that space, you can never quite forget that some choices echo forever without ever reaching their conclusion. Some investigations never close, they just transfer to officers who don't know they're already dead. I'm Detective Iris Caldwell, Newark Police Department Major Crimes Unit, and I've been working serious felonies for 13 years. The precinct house on Oakmont Avenue has always felt wrong to me. Too many cold spots, too many shadows that move when nobody's walking past, Too many nights when I hear typewriters clacking from offices that have been empty since the building converted to digital filing. But I chalked it up to old architecture and stress fatigue until I started finding case files that shouldn't have existed, investigations that had been closed for decades but were somehow still generating new evidence. Our precinct was built in 1974, replacing an older station that had burned down under suspicious circumstances. The new building used the same foundation and basement structure, but everything above ground was modern construction, designed to house the expanded police force that Newark needed during the urban renewal period. Most officers who work here know the basic history. The old station had been built in the 1920s and had served the neighborhood through some of its roughest decades before the fire claimed it in 1968. What nobody talks about is why the old station burned, or what happened to the officers who'd been working there during the final years. According to the department's official records, the fire was electrical in origin and occurred during off hours when the building was empty. But the insurance investigation files tell a different story, one about police officers who'd been investigating a series of ritual murders in the neighborhood and had disappeared one by one during the months leading up to the fire. Their cases had been transferred to other detectives, their desks had been cleared, and their names had been quietly removed from the duty roster. I first encountered the anomaly while working a burglary case that had expanded into something more complex. The suspect had broken into several apartments in the Oakmont area, but instead of stealing valuables, he'd been rearranging furniture in patterns that resembled crime scene layouts. When I pulled the building's security footage, I found something that made me question my understanding of how evidence storage works. Surveillance recordings that showed the same burglary being investigated by officers I didn't recognize, wearing uniforms that hadn't been issued by the department in decades. The footage was time-stamped with current dates, but the investigating officers were using equipment and procedures that predated modern police work. They carried revolvers instead of semi-automatic pistols, used handheld radios the size of briefcases, and took crime scene photographs with cameras that required flashbulb. When I tried to identify them through department records, I found personnel files for officers who'd officially died or disappeared in the 1960s, but their case notes were dated this year. I brought the anomaly to my supervisor, Lieutenant Maria Gonzalez, expecting her to help me understand how archived footage had been mislabeled with current timestamps. Instead, she seemed uncomfortable with my questions and suggested I focus on closing the burglary case rather than investigating technical problems with our surveillance system. When I pressed for an explanation, she admitted that similar issues had been reported by other detectives, but that the department preferred to handle them quietly to avoid causing confusion or superstitious behavior among the officers. That night, I stayed late in the precinct to review more security footage and examine the evidence storage protocols. The building felt different after hours, heavier, more oppressive, with sounds that seemed to emanate from the basement levels that weren't supposed to be accessible. I could hear voices having conversations in offices that should have been empty, typewriters preparing reports for cases that had been closed for decades, and the distant sound of police radios receiving calls from dispatchers who'd been dead for over 50 years. The basement was where I found the real evidence. Behind a locked door that my keycard shouldn't have opened, I discovered an entire archive of case files from the old Oakmont station. The files were organized exactly like our current evidence room, but they contained investigations that had never been transferred to the new precinct. Ritual murders, occult activity, missing persons cases with supernatural elements, all investigated by officers whose names appeared on memorial plaques upstairs, honoring those who died in the line of duty. The most disturbing files belonged to Detective Raymond Kowalski, who'd been investigating a series of ritualistic killings in 1967, before disappearing in February of 1968, just months before the fire. His case notes were handwritten in careful script, documenting evidence that suggested the murders were connected to a cult operating in the neighborhood. But the timestamps on his reports showed he'd been filing updates as recently as last month, investigating new crimes that matched the pattern he'd identified over 50 years ago. I found surveillance footage of Detective Kowalski in our current evidence room, examining items that had been collected from my active cases. He moved through the space with the familiarity of someone who worked there regularly, but he cast no shadow and made no sound that the recording equipment could capture. When he handled evidence bags, they remained sealed, but their contents somehow changed. Crime scene photos showed additional details that hadn't been visible in the original images. Witness statements contained information that hadn't been recorded during the interviews. The pattern extended to other missing officers from the old station. Detective Angela Torres, who disappeared while investigating occult symbols found at crime scenes, was still documenting new instances of the same markings in current cases. Sergeant William Chen, who'd vanished while pursuing leads about ritual sacrifice, was continuing his investigation, using evidence from recent homicides that showed identical patterns to his original cases. They were all still working, still trying to solve crimes that had killed them decades ago. I realized that the burning of the old station hadn't ended the investigations. It had trapped the officers in a loop where they continued their cases, using evidence from crimes that occurred in the same locations, generation after generation. The new precinct had been built on a foundation of unfinished police work, and the officers who died pursuing those cases were still reporting for duty, still trying to solve mysteries that had consumed them in life. The most horrifying discovery was in my own case files. The burglary suspect I'd been tracking was connected to the ritual murder pattern that Detective Kowalski had been investigating in 1967. The furniture arrangements he'd been creating matched crime scene layouts from the old cases, and the apartments he'd targeted were in buildings where ritual murders had occurred decades earlier. I wasn't investigating a new crime. I was continuing an investigation that had been active for over 50 years. My case notes were being updated by Detective Kowalski's handwriting. Evidence I'd collected was being processed by procedures that predated modern forensic science. Witness statements I'd recorded were being supplemented with information from people who'd been interviewed decades ago by officers who were officially dead. The investigation was continuing itself, using current crimes to advance cases that should have been closed by retirement or death. I tried to leave the precinct that night, but the building seemed to resist my departure. Hallways led to offices that shouldn't have existed. Stairwells descended deeper than the building's blueprints indicated, and exit doors opened onto the same basement archive where I'd found the impossible case files. Every attempt to leave brought me back to the evidence room, where Detective Kowalski was still examining items from my cases, still trying to solve murders that had killed him before I was born. When I finally managed to reach the parking garage, I found my car surrounded by police vehicles from the 1960s, black and white sedans, with light bars and sirens that hadn't been used in decades. The dead officers were standing beside their vehicles, reviewing case files and comparing notes about investigations that spanned multiple generations. They acknowledged me with professional nods, the way officers do when they're working the same case but different shifts. Detective Kowalski approached me with a case file that contained my name on the tab. Inside were crime scene photos of my apartment, witness statements describing my daily routine, and evidence suggesting I'd become part of the ritual murder pattern he'd been investigating. According to his notes, officers who got too close to solving the case didn't disappear. They joined the investigation permanently, continuing their work from beyond death. I woke up the next morning at my desk in the precinct, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My case files had been reorganized by someone else's system, and my computer contained reports I hadn't written. The burglary case had been solved. The suspect had confessed and provided information about ritual activities in the neighborhood, but the confession was signed with my name in handwriting that looked like mine, but felt like someone else's. I submitted my resignation that day, but Human Resources claimed they had no record of Detective Iris Caldwell ever working for the Newark Police Department. My badge and service weapon had been reassigned to another detective, and my cases had been transferred to officers whose names weren't in the current personnel database. According to the department's records, I'd never existed. I still drive past the Oakmont precinct sometimes, and I can see lights in windows that should be empty, officers working cases that should be closed. The building continues to investigate crimes that began decades ago, using new evidence to advance old cases and recruiting new officers to replace those who get too close to solutions that can't be reached by the living. Some investigations never end, they just expand to include everyone who tries to solve them, creating an eternal police force, working cases that span generations of crime and punishment. The ritual murders are still happening in the Oakmont neighborhood, and the police are still investigating them. But the officers working those cases aren't limited by retirement or death. They have all the time in the world to solve mysteries that have been killing people for over 50 years, and they're always recruiting new detectives who don't realize they're already part of the evidence they're trying to collect. Some machinery never stops running, it just runs in places that used to be. I'm Benjamin Stone, Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation Task Force 7, and I've been working multi-jurisdictional serial cases for 10 years. Most serial killers follow patterns you can map, motives you can understand, and methods that leave evidence pointing toward human psychology. But the Ashford Industrial District case introduced me to something far more disturbing: the possibility that some killers aren't human at all. And some murder weapons are machines that were destroyed decades ago, but somehow continue claiming victims in the empty spaces where they used to operate. Task Force 7 handles cases that cross county lines or involve unusual circumstances that local departments can't resolve independently. We're called in when patterns emerge that suggest coordinated activity, when evidence points to suspects with resources beyond typical criminal capabilities, or when the nature of the crimes defies conventional investigation. The Ashford case qualified on all three criteria: 7 victims found dead in industrial locations across northeastern Ohio, all positioned as if they died in workplace accidents involving machinery that hadn't existed for years. The victims had no apparent connection to each other. Different ages, occupations, social circles, and geographic locations. What unified them was how and where they died. Each body was discovered in an abandoned industrial site, positioned with mechanical precision, as if they'd been caught in industrial equipment during normal operation. But the sites had been cleared and demolished years earlier, leaving only empty lots and concrete foundations where factories and mills used to stand. The first victim was Robert Chen, a software engineer found in the ruins of the Ashford paper mill in Akron. The mill had been demolished in 2009, but Chen's body was positioned as if he'd been caught in a paper cutting machine, his injuries consistent with industrial blade trauma. The medical examiner confirmed that the wounds matched the specifications of equipment that had been scrapped over a decade earlier. Yet there was no machinery present at the scene, just an empty lot with concrete footings where the mill floor used to be. Similar discoveries followed across the region. Jennifer Walsh was found in the former location of a textile factory in Youngstown, her body positioned as if she'd been caught in spinning machinery that had been demolished in 2006. Michael Torres appeared in the remains of a steel processing plant in Canton, injured in ways consistent with heavy press equipment that had been removed and sold for scrap 8 years before his death. Each scene showed evidence of industrial accidents involving specific machines, but the machines themselves didn't exist. I was assigned as lead investigator when the pattern became clear enough to suggest serial activity. The task force designation allowed me to coordinate with multiple county coroner offices, access industrial safety records from companies that no longer existed, and request federal assistance with forensic analysis of evidence that challenged conventional understanding of how people die in workplace accidents. What I found was more disturbing than any human serial killer I'd encountered. The industrial sites retained detailed records of their equipment specifications, safety procedures, and accident reports from their operational years. When I compared the victims' injuries to historical workplace accidents at the same locations, I found exact matches, not similar injuries, but identical trauma patterns that matched specific incidents that had occurred decades earlier. Robert Chen's wounds were identical to an accident that had killed a mill worker named Thomas Patterson in 1987. Jennifer Walsh's injuries matched a textile factory incident from 1993 that had claimed the life of operator Sarah Kim. The historical accident reports contain details that should have been irrelevant to my current investigation: machine serial numbers, safety violation citations, insurance claim documentation. But when I compared the forensic evidence from recent victims to the archived industrial accident reports, every detail matched perfectly. The victims weren't just dying in ways that resembled historical accidents. They were dying in precisely the same accidents, caused by the same machines, following the same sequences of mechanical failure that had killed workers decades earlier. I began investigating the demolition records for each industrial site, looking for evidence that equipment might have been left behind, or that demolition companies might have been careless about completely clearing the locations. What I found was even more unsettling. The demolition had been thorough and well documented. Every piece of machinery had been removed, sold, or scrapped according to environmental and safety regulations. But witness statements from demolition crews mentioned strange experiences during the clearing process. Several demolition workers reported hearing machinery operating during night shifts, when all equipment had been shut down. Others described seeing industrial equipment in areas that had already been cleared, only to find empty space when they investigated. The most disturbing reports came from crew supervisors who documented safety violations involving machinery that didn't appear on any inventory lists, workers injured by equipment that wasn't supposed to be present, accidents involving machines that had allegedly been removed days earlier. I interviewed Gary Novak, a demolition foreman who'd worked on 3 of the sites where bodies had been discovered. He described experiences that sounded like hallucinations, but were corroborated by multiple crew members and documented in incident reports that had been filed with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. During the Ashford paper mill demolition, workers had reported seeing the paper cutting machines still operating after they'd been disconnected and removed from the building. Some crew members had been injured by machinery that security cameras showed as empty space. The pattern became clear when I examined the timeline of demolitions versus the dates of victim discoveries. The industrial accidents weren't random. They were occurring on the anniversaries of historical workplace fatalities at the same locations. Robert Chen had died on March 15th, exactly 37 years after Thomas Patterson's accident at the Ashford paper mill. Jennifer Walsh had been found on September 22nd, matching the date of Sarah Kim's death in the textile factory. The machinery was somehow continuing to operate on schedule, claiming victims according to the same calendar that had governed industrial accidents during the facility's operational years. I decided to conduct surveillance at the former Youngstown textile factory site on the anniversary of the next historical accident documented in my files. According to safety records, a worker named Maria Santos had died in a loom malfunction on November 8, 1996. If the pattern held, someone would be found dead at that location on November 8th, positioned as if killed by textile machinery that had been demolished 18 years earlier. I arrived at the site before dawn, accompanied by Detective Helen Murphy from the Youngstown Police Department and crime scene technician Alex Rivera. The location was a vacant lot in an industrial district that had been largely abandoned since the economic downturn. City planning records showed the textile factory had occupied the entire block, but only concrete foundations and utility access points remained visible. We positioned ourselves with clear sight lines and recording equipment, expecting to observe either a killer bringing victims to the site or victims arriving under some form of coercion. What we witnessed defied every assumption I'd made about how crimes occur in physical reality. At exactly 3:17 p.m., the same time documented in Maria Santos's accident report, the empty lot began to fill with the sounds of industrial machinery. We could hear looms operating, steam hisses, the mechanical rhythm of textile production, but we saw nothing except vacant space. The sounds grew louder and more complex, building to the crescendo of mechanical failure that had characterized the original accident. A woman appeared in the center of the lot, not arriving from any direction, but simply materializing, as if she'd always been there. She moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone performing familiar work, her hands operating invisible machinery with practiced precision. But as she worked, her movements became more frantic, her actions more desperate, until she was struggling with equipment that existed only in the sounds we could hear and the terror we could see in her face. The accident played out exactly as described in the historical safety report. The woman's clothing became entangled in machinery we couldn't see. Her body was drawn into mechanisms that left no visible trace, and she died with the same injuries that had killed Maria Santos 28 years earlier. But this wasn't Maria Santos. This was Rebecca Hayes, a contemporary victim who'd somehow been drawn into a workplace accident that was replaying itself in the empty space where the factory used to stand. We found Rebecca's body positioned exactly as Maria Santos had been discovered in 1996, but there was no machinery present to explain her injuries. The medical examiner would later confirm that her wounds were consistent with textile loom mechanisms, specifically the model that had been installed in the Youngstown factory and had caused the original accident. But the loom that killed her had been scrapped 18 years earlier and no longer existed anywhere except in the traumatic memory that the location had somehow retained. Detective Murphy and I reviewed our surveillance footage repeatedly, but the cameras had recorded only ambient noise and the discovery of Rebecca Hayes's body. The industrial sounds that had filled the air for over an hour weren't captured by our audio equipment, and the machinery that had killed her left no trace on any of our recording devices. We'd witnessed a murder committed by equipment that existed only in the intersection between historical trauma and present reality. The task force officially closed the case when the pattern stopped. No more victims were found after our surveillance operation at the Youngstown site. The report classified the deaths as a series of unrelated industrial accidents caused by unknown factors, possibly involving concealed machinery or environmental hazards that hadn't been properly cleared during demolition. It was a conclusion that satisfied bureaucratic requirements while avoiding the implications of what we'd actually discovered. I've transferred to white-collar crime investigation, cases that involve financial fraud and corporate malfeasance, but don't require me to spend time in abandoned industrial areas. Some places retain more than just concrete foundations and utility connections. They retain the capacity to repeat their worst moments, using present-day victims to reenact historical tragedies. The Ashford Industrial District taught me that machinery never really stops running. It just runs in dimensions that cameras can't capture and on schedules that were set decades ago by accidents that were never properly resolved. Ohio has hundreds of abandoned industrial sites where workers died in accidents that were classified as inevitable hazards of manufacturing. Some of those accidents are still happening, claiming new victims according to old schedules, operated by machinery that continues working in the spaces where it used to be. The dead don't rest in places where their deaths were considered acceptable costs of industrial progress, and some schedules are maintained by forces that transcend demolition and time itself.